Welcome, Evan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to chat.
You talked a little bit on there about the idea of age verification. This is something I also care a lot about, and something that's been in the news where Australia implemented this sort of famous legislation now, which claims that they're going to fine companies who let minors 16 and under use this kind of social media knowingly. So if the social media companies know that there's a minor using it, then they will do something. And the argument has been twofold. One, maybe they'll just use AI to magically detect what a young person does and looks like and talks about. Or they'll do facial recognition, or they'll check everyone's IDs. I know that even though that's not directly in COSA, one of the implications of it for the US would be the only way to comply with this law, or the easy way in which they can comply with this law, is to just ID everybody. And, I live in New Zealand, where there's a proposal for this, and the proposal is amazing because it lacks privacy protections. It just says, there's only one little line about privacy protections, and it says that if you are a minor who is banned from social media, the companies should protect your privacy and private data. But what it means is they now have to collect the data on everybody, and they can keep it and they can use it for whatever they want. How is it that we end up in this world where, in order to protect kids, we don't realize that you can't do it without identifying everyone if you're going to filter them out? I wonder if you could talk about sort of how does age verification work, and why is it problematic?
Yeah, totally. Great questions. And I think, to be totally honest, part of how we land here is, again, people with good intentions and a lack of understanding of how the technology works and what the kind of risks associated are. So with age verification, I think part of the issue is we already have age verification in a number of instances that we're all very familiar with, right? You go to the liquor store, you show your ID to buy liquor. You go to the airport, you show your ID, you buy cigarettes or, whatever. So we're kind of familiar with it in those contexts.
Ironically enough, in New Zealand, you don't need an ID to fly. You never show your ID when you fly. But
I love that.
It's a very small country.
Yes.
I love the fact that you can fly with privacy and you don't need your ID. But
yeah,
almost everywhere else in the world, you do have to show your ID.
Right. But almost everywhere else you do. And, and again, in terms of online age verification, it's more similar to like I said, showing your ID to buy alcohol or something like that. But when you go to the liquor store to buy alcohol, the clerk looks at your ID and says, yeah, that seems like you. They don't take a photo of your ID, store it in their database forever, match it with a biometric scan of your face that they also store forever, and then use to train their store AI facial recognition detection system.
And then connect it to stuff from data brokers, because you guys run a whole campaign about data brokers. So all of a sudden, now they know exactly who you are. They know exactly who everyone is. And you've now empowered their algorithmic advertising engine.
Absolutely. And then, what you're also doing is you're entrusting your government ID, very sensitive information, or a biometric scan of your face with a private company. And we all know that private companies have a terrible track record of safeguarding our information. I mean, how many of us, how many times a year do you get an email from your health insurance company or your credit card company being like, hey, sorry about this, but, data breach, oopsie. We may have lost some of your sensitive data, but we're really sorry, and we're going to sign you up for 3 months of free credit reporting to make it up to you or whatever. And, but the reality is, if your credit card leaks, you can go get a new credit card. If your social security number leaks, you can go get a new social security number. If a biometric scan of your face leaks, you can't go get a new face. If your government ID with a photo of you leaks, that's can lead to really serious privacy harms. And that's before we even get into all the ways, as you said, that the companies themselves could be using, abusing, selling, monetizing, training AI on this new trove of data that the government is now basically not just kind of giving them the green light to collect, but actually forcing them to collect, and it's kind of wild, right? Like, it's like, we're like, these big tech companies are so evil, they collect too much of our data. Anyhow, we're going to pass a law that makes them collect even more of our data. The reality is these policies are sort of like, they sound reasonable on paper. Like, you need to show your ID when you go buy alcohol offline. You should have to show your ID if you want to go read wine reviews online. You have to show your ID before you go buy an adult magazine at Barnes & Noble. You should have to show your ID before you go log into an OnlyFans account. Like, these things all sound like they make sense until you get into the actual technical implementation of how you do it. And then you realize that they really just lead to more harms. And I think that's where, again, like, the solutions to some of these problems are not actually technical solutions. They're societal solutions, right? If every young person had access to a safe place to sleep at night, trusted adults who they can go to if they come upon a piece of content that makes them uncomfortable, or a message from a stranger that seems suspicious. So much, like, I feel like so many of these folks that say they want to protect kids are just not actually interested in listening to kids. And it's really hard to protect kids when, like, you don't listen to them. But if you actually listen to your kids and have a trusting relationship, and as you said at the outset, like, engage with the content they're watching. I try to, like, the amount of videos about Minecraft that I have subjected myself to, just so that, like, my kid doesn't feel ashamed coming and talking to me about what kind of content she's consuming, has rotted my brain. But what it actually has led to is, like, we do have a trusting relationship. We can talk about what she's experiencing online. And, I do think that that's important. I will say, I think that the pushback on that is, like, it shouldn't only be up to parents. And I do think there is a role for policy and for government to address some of these harms. I also think there's a huge role for technologists and software developers and people to keep trying to build our way out of this and build the better alternatives that we need. And that's why I commend folks like you that are, like, actually out there trying to build the thing and be like, see, it doesn't have to be this way. But I think it's like a combination of all of the above, right? And, like, in some ways we need some policy, I think, to get us from here to there, because frankly, the level of monopoly and monopolization that the current kind of cabal of social media companies have is so intense that I think they've kind of been able to nuke from orbit a lot of the alternatives that have come up. But I think that's starting to shift. I think, a lot of people jumped ship from X when Elon Musk bought X, and there have been big exoduses from some of the other platforms. And I think, like, folks are starting to see that, like, there can be alternatives. But I do think to really see that, like, massive societal shift, we would need some policies to crack down on the big tech companies' ability to, enclose, like, make it harder for people to leave, kill or buy competitors as they get popular, et cetera. And, like, those are, like, if lawmakers want to, quote unquote, do something about big tech, like, gosh, they have some real options. Antitrust legislation and privacy legislation are right there. They're bipartisan. They're not as controversial as legislation like KOSA that raises these free speech issues, but they also don't sound as sexy on paper as, the magical protect the kids and get rid of the terrorists and, save the puppies bill. The
TikTok law, the one that was passed in order to force the sale of the American part of TikTok to American investors. Nominally, they said they were doing it because they were concerned about private data. They were concerned about user data going to China. And you're like, well, why don't you just pass a privacy law? And the United States has no privacy law. But I want to get back to something you talked about, which is, like, how do these monopolies keep their monopolies? Like, what is it structurally that we've got set up? And I had Cory Doctorow on, who was talking about the way in which these companies are using DRM, using copyright law in order to create locks on your technology. But you, with Fight for the Future, have run a campaign around, freeing the iPhone, around looking at these app stores, the way in which you install it and what can be installed on your phone as itself a really important kind of control and censorship, and also reinforcing of the existing giant corporate monopoly. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that campaign a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this has come up in some, like, kind of interesting ways. Like, It was a couple years ago where there were folks on the left that were really pushing for Apple and Google to ban Parler from the App Store. Like right-wing social media app.
There's a push right now to ban Grok.
There's a push right now to ban Grok. And I'm no fan of Parler. I'm no fan of X or Grok. And, I would even argue with Grok, it does seem like Grok is probably violating Apple and Google's App Store policies. And it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to enforce those policies. And I don't want to live in a world where two companies get to decide what software we can run on the devices that we own. And, we've seen this play out. It's been rare in the US that there has been kind of explicit app censorship, although not it's not unheard of. There was
it happens.
ICE block.
Yeah, they kicked off the ICE trap.
Yeah, the app that was used to track ICE agents got kicked out of the App Store, while the app that ICE agents are using to conduct facial recognition on the street remains in the App Store. So again, these companies they're not brave. They want to make money. They will do whatever they feel like they have to do to appease the powers that be. And what it creates is a situation where you can censor almost any app with two emails, one to Google and one to Apple, if you're a government with enough power. And so I think, we've called to basically abolish the App Store. And really, we need to have a fundamental right to be able to write and run software on devices that we own. It seems like a kind of obscure issue or something that only, I'm not even a technologist, right? When people start talking to me about their cool Linux build, I'm like, sounds great, buddy. Don't know what you mean, but I'd love to hear it. But, we can all kind of, I think one thing I often say to non-technologists is this is as foundational as any other issue I think we can imagine. And especially as we head into a world with AI agents, with wearable tech, with, so many more things that we own being connected to the internet, connected to each other, our ability to pick and choose what software we run on devices we own and not have software forced down our throats is going to be one of the most foundational human rights issues of the next 100 years, I would argue. And we're, again, we're kind of in a battle right now between this walled garden, closed, you pick the kingdom that you want to live in and you hope the king keeps you safe situation, which is where we are now. And then, but it could be different. We could have a much more open environment, which doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't still choose to live in one of those walled gardens and be all right, I'm only going to trust the apps in this app store from these people. But it would be
you can install software on your computer that would only let you go to certain websites and blocked all the porn sites so you couldn't go into it. And the funny thing is we have on our computers the ability to install any software we want. But the thing we have with us all the time is this phone. That is the primary way in which most people access the internet, and we don't realize that there's a tremendous amount of control and very little freedom in terms of what apps do. And Apple and Google, they're, along with credit card companies, oddly enough, major regulators of speech in the internet that we have today. And they say they're doing it for our protection, but this gets into another campaign that you guys have run, which is around data brokers, because there are little extensions in all of these apps that are used for advertising that collect your location information, your activity, who you're around, what you're doing, all of this information, and then they sell it on a private market in these massive markets. And I know that Fight for the Future has been working on a campaign around these data brokers that we don't even know are happening. And, and it's on your phone and it's in your car too. So I wonder if you could talk about what the hell is going on with data brokers, because most people don't even know they exist.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, this is one of these things where it's just so frustrating because politicians love to talk about big tech and how they're tough on big tech and they're going to do something about this. And again, we have no national privacy law in the United States. It's a national embarrassment. And we have essentially no regulation of the data broker industry, which allows, without a privacy law, companies can more or less collect as much information about you as you want. And with this unregulated data broker market, they can buy and sell it to almost anyone else. And, the most visible version of this is, if you've ever like Googled your own name, there's all of these like people finder sites that promise you like, oh, do you want to find out if your ex has a DUI or, court records, that kind of stuff. But there's, that's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And what is hidden behind all of that is just enormous amounts of data that gets bought and sold around. Some of it is quote unquote anonymized, as in, well, we're going to sell a whole bunch of location data, but we're not going to tell you exactly whose it was. But often that anonymized data, which any technologist can tell you, can be de-anonymized and then reassociated with individual people. After the Dobbs decision, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I feel like I got like basically every reporter in the country called me to ask about period tracking apps specifically. And there definitely were data concerns there. But what I said was, your Candy Crush game on your phone is just as likely to rat you out for having been sitting in an abortion clinic as your period tracking app. Because the reality is, as you said, basically every app whose business model is rooted in surveillance advertising is collecting some type of sensitive data on you. And then that data can be bought and sold. What I will say is there are some glimmers of hope on this issue. It's been one of the few tech issues that's been a little bit more bipartisan. I think partly because, again, even Republican senators are worried about their own private data being bought and sold. And so we have seen some efforts. There's actually a California provision in the CCPA that basically makes it easier with like one click to opt out of a whole bunch of data brokers at the same time. And we've been actually advocating for the FTC to do that at the federal level in the same way that they have like a do not call list for advertisers that a lot of people are familiar with. You should be able to go to one single government website and say, I want to opt out of data brokers, and they should have to respect that. That would be like one simple step that the FTC could do right now that would meaningfully protect people. And, that's actually like a bipartisan idea that we could fight for and actually get implemented sometime in the next couple of years. So some glimmer of hope in these trying times. But I think, again, just to bring the issue back home, there's data brokerage, and then there's just data sharing that happens as well. And we know, for example, that Flock, the surveillance company that does license plate scanning, has been sharing data with ICE in some circumstances. I don't even think they're selling it. They're not even making money of it. They're doing it for free as a way to sort of bone graft themselves to the US government surveillance apparatus because they see that as their future profit model, basically selling these surveillance devices to towns and cities. And, being buds with ICE is a good way to help them do that. So again, all of these different things kind of weave together. The remedies lie in strong privacy legislation, in designing our technology to be surveillance resistant, and then, holding accountable our elected officials. We have mayors on TV right now saying, fuck ICE, but if their city has a Flock contract,
and they're not canceling,
talk is cheap.
There are a few cities that actually have recently canceled their Flock contract and removed these license plate trackers that are handing it over. But I don't think that enough people know about it. They don't realize that it is possible to stop some of this surveillance, and that movements of people need to not just do the showing up in the streets the way people do done in Minneapolis and across the United States with whistles when ICE happens, but we need to set the space by which we have that privacy and that we continue to organize.